Let's talk about the explore-exploit trade-off. What is it? Why should everybody know about it? And how does it function or operate maybe a little bit differently in ADHD? What modern environments or maybe what modern occupations might actually favor these type of traits? Do you think G genuinely predicts anything?
I have some pretty sophisticated views on this intelligence question and G in particular. Is that G? That doesn't tell us anything about intelligence.
Do we forage every day of our lives? How do we bridge the idea that ADHD might be or might have been an advantage in certain evolutionary settings with the mismatch hypothesis? Polygenic studies actually suggest that ADHD people or people with ADHD traits might actually veer towards entrepreneurship and opening a business. David, welcome. Thanks for joining. I've been looking forward to talking to you for a while.
Thank you so much for having me on today.
So just to begin, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself and your background? Because your work is really interesting and I want to get into it, but just maybe a brief bio.
Yeah, sure. So I have a little bit of an unusual background for a researcher. So my home discipline in the academy is in philosophy, and in particular, philosophy of mind. So I study and investigate what it means for something to think, where do our experiences come from. I also focus on philosophy of science, so trying to understand how scientists go about explaining things, how they go about constructing theories, what the nature of their discoveries are, and so forth. Specifically, I focus on philosophy of neuroscience, and that should come as no surprise because I'm also trained unusually as a neurophysiologist. So even though I have a doctorate in philosophy, I was trained actually in the techniques to record electrical signals from the brain while animals, including humans who are animals, make decisions in the world around them. As part of that research program and training, I launched an investigation into the way that the brain makes decisions when animals are searching for resources in the environment. In other words, when animals are making foraging decisions. These are the kinds of decisions that you might make where, for example, if you are in a new city and you're not really sure what the best restaurants are, you kind of have a range of possible places to eat, and you have to make a decision about where to go for dinner. And so there's different ways you might do that, to gather information, to actually try different restaurants and so forth. That kind of work, it turns out, reflects these really deep ancestral drives and motivations in the human brain and the primate brain more generally, because those kinds of decisions are so central to the survival of organisms. So our brains are these finely tuned engines for making these kinds of decisions. And I use that approach to better understand how we behave and how we choose.
Okay, that's fascinating. So obviously your work is interdisciplinary. Could I just ask the question, do we forage every day of our lives? Like, is every decision where we brainstorm or we consider multiple options, is that foraging, or is it a bit more specific than that?
It is. So I have argued that foraging is more specific than just decision making on the one hand, or just search on the other. It's a more specific version of both. In particular, foraging reflects a series of decisions. So not just like a one-off decision between a banana and an apple, but instead a series of decisions in the search for resources. In addition, when you're foraging, you're typically not choosing between options so much as you are choosing whether to continue doing what you're doing. So that's called a foreground option. Like, do I want this banana? Or to move on from that option to search for a new one. In other words, not taking the banana and searching for a new one. So that's rather unlike many of our decisions. But in addition, foraging is a type of search. It's a decision made when we're searching for resources. So if we know exactly where things are in the environment, we don't need to forage. We can just navigate our way straight there. Similarly, if we know exactly what we are looking for, so if we're not operating from a position of uncertainty or a position of ignorance, then we are also not engaged in foraging. So, for example, you might know you would like a new car, and you might know exactly the make, let's say a Volkswagen, and the model, like a cabriolet, of that car. You might even know the color. You might know all the specs. So when you're engaged in that kind of search, which is sometimes called template matching search, you're also not foraging because you're looking for a specific item in the environment. So that's also a different kind of search. So foraging involves this sort of decision-making and search under ignorance, where you're repeatedly offered options and you're making decisions about whether to accept that offer or to reject it in search of a new one.
Okay, very interesting. So with the rise of large language models, and especially the way they've been operating over the last 2 years, reasoning models, so I'm curious, how does foraging relate to reasoning? So are they connected? When we're foraging, are we reasoning, or would you split them there?
Yeah, right. So I'm actually published arguing that reasoning is, on this specific question I'm published, arguing that reasoning is a type of foraging, not the other way around. So let me paint a picture for what I think is going on here. So the simplest organisms in evolutionary history are going to be organisms with a relatively sparse or very poor cognitive machinery, okay? And it required eons and millennia, millions and millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of years for very sophisticated brains to evolve. Now, the idea is that these relatively simple organisms, nonetheless, still had to search for food or for opportunities to mate with other members of their species. So you have these selective pressures for search and for decision-making, oftentimes in the context of a foraging decision. So these organisms are offered or come across opportunities one at a time in the environment, and they're making decisions about whether or not to accept that offer or to move on in search of a new one. So foraging is this basic fundamental competence of almost any mobile organism. So you get the sophisticated machinery for making foraging decisions, or even unsophisticated, because the computations, the ways of transforming information required to make a foraging decision are relatively simple in comparison to other behaviors, well before you get the kind of machinery that gives rise to sophisticated reasoning, inference, logical, and other kinds of capacities that are the exquisite domain of humans in particular, but primates and other large mammals generally, certainly, and I would actually argue extend to many other species. So what I propose in some of my work is that you have this pre-existing capacity for making these kinds of search decisions, and then those mechanisms are used or redeployed or reused for reasoning. So the system, as evolution selects for more complex organisms, or as the selective pressures in particular niches select for more complex neural machinery, these kinds of pre-existing circuits are used for internal search, for searching through our cognitive spaces, searching through abstract spaces as well. No longer searching for food, minerals, water, other members of your species. Now you're searching through things like, different ways to get to food resources, or you're searching through different strategies to acquire food and other resources. And then from there, from that sort of inward directed search, the kind of doors open to all kinds of sophisticated cognitive phenomena. For example, you can search through memories. You can forage through memories. There's some good evidence that we forage through memories. You can forage through arguments when you're engaged in reasoning. So there's this wealth of sophisticated cognitive abilities we have, and I argue that those abilities are grounded in these pre-existing skills we have for foraging, skills and circuits for foraging, and that help us to explain and understand why humans have this really sophisticated cognitive suite.
Very interesting. So it seems to me that you might argue a little bit against the generalizable ability of intelligence, and maybe the idea of IQ or psychometric G. So we don't all have a G factor where multiple abilities overlap, and maybe the same thing in benchmarks. And you'd actually, like benchmarks in AI, and you'd actually argue that intelligence should also take into account the environment and the context and possibly the culture and the richness of it. Is that a fair assessment or summary of what you believe about intelligence?
So I have some pretty sophisticated views on this intelligence question and G in particular. I actually posted a preprint on Archive about 3 or 4 years now, laying out my view on intelligence.
I read that, yeah. That was with a DeepMind scientist, I think, wasn't it?
That's right. Yeah, with a colleague and friend of mine who's a DeepMind. So let me say straight off that G is not a real measure of intelligence. G is essentially the dominant or principal component that explains the most variance in behavioral tests that are intended or designed to assess intelligence. So what does that mean? That means that I might give an individual, or in fact, many, many, many individuals, something like an intelligence test, which is really just many, many, many sort of questions, quizzes, little games that they have to play. And some do better and some do worse. And so at the end of the day, I have this very, very large set of individuals who have completed a very large number of these kinds of problems. And then I can use these sophisticated statistical techniques, and I can try and find a commonality between them all that explains the most variability in those test scores. Now, what does that tell us? Is that G? That doesn't tell us anything about intelligence. That just says that, well, there's going to be some correlations between those test scores. And so there's going to be a way of redescribing that data that has this first or main component in the data that explains the most variance, how much those test scores fluctuate. Nothing about that is about intelligence. It's a statistical technique. If anything, what it's picking out is that we all have a brain and a basic set of cognitive abilities. And of course, there's going to be correlations because we can all read, we can all solve problems, and so on. And different individuals will have more or less of their variability explained by that first dimension. But that first dimension isn't intelligence. Intelligence is a sophisticated cognitive construct. It's much more complex than this one underlying statistical phantasm. And so we have to be very careful when we talk about intelligence, because the tests and statistical tools that we use to assess intelligence, in particular the outcomes of those statistical tools, don't necessarily relate to this relatively complex concept of intelligence. Instead, if we turn and look at what intelligence is, it's really the capacity to behave in an environment, an agent's ability to behave in an environment. If you take George Jetson, I'm not sure if you're familiar with like the Jetsons, it's this old cartoon, and George Jetson, the Jetson family lives in this space house and they have all kinds of fancy technology, and he works at a factory where he can push a button. This is very far in the future, obviously. He pushes a button and all kinds of complex things occur. If you stick George Jetson in the Flintstones context, so the Flintstones was another 1980s cartoon about a Stone Age family where they have no technology, he's going to do very poorly. So even though in his own context, he pushes a button and he can construct a fantastically powerful robot, if you stick him in a different context, all of a sudden, these abilities and skills he has disappear. But vice versa, if you take George Flintstone, who exists in the Stone Age, he's very adept at making stone tools, at finding food and resources, all the kinds of skills you might anticipate someone who was raised in that kind of environment will be able to accomplish and have the capacity to perform. And stick them into the future, he's going to completely fall apart. None of his abilities and skills, which are finely tuned to the environment. But furthermore, the products of intelligence aren't just from the agent. It's the agent's interaction with the environment and taking advantage of the environment. So the way I like to think about this is as follows, to accommodate these kinds of facts. When we talk about some agent, some person being intelligent, what we're really saying is this person in this context is intelligent. So that means this, what we say in philosophy, we talk about a predicate, like is blue or is large. This person is intelligent. This predicate doesn't pick out a property of the person. It picks out a property of the person in the environment. So this is a more sophisticated view of intelligence that takes into what I think is a relatively obvious point that different individuals in different contexts can be more or less intelligent. And so when we talk about intelligence, we should be careful not to mistake the statistical tools and tests that we use as actually measuring intelligence, but also we have to avoid this conceptual confusion of thinking of intelligence as a feature or property of the individual. Instead, in fact, it's a feature or property of the individual in a context. And that, I think, is very important.
Do you think G genuinely predicts anything? Because obviously there is a lot of claims and there seems to be relatively strong evidence it is predictive of things like education outcomes and even lifespan and health span. Do you take issue with that? Is it just that the context was wrong?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Expand.
Because again, G is this first dimension of variation across many, many tests. And unsurprisingly, that will also account for a lot of variation across all these other very large scale measures. And consequently, I don't think it's surprising that you see those kinds of correlations. And it's also not informative because intelligence is this sophisticated concept, and these statistical tools are completely blind to the content of that concept.
Interesting. And I guess, so something I've been curious about for a while is that we can't define human intelligence. And again, like psychometricians don't really have a definition of human intelligence. They kind of just point to the tests. Also, I don't know if we understand how the brain works on different levels, like how the different levels connect. I think you might know a little bit about this or have thoughts on it. So how do we get from a few circuits of neurons to abstract concepts like religion or philosophy or spirituality or even law, justice? Like how do these circuits of neurons get to these higher level ideas or abstract concepts?
Yeah, good. Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, in many ways, this is at the heart of these big questions in philosophy across millennia. What is the relationship between the mind and the physical world? You can think of the mind, of course, it has something to do with the brain. But when we look at typical studies of the brain, oftentimes they're studies of very, very small things, individual neurons, proteins, and other kinds of biological molecules and biological activity within neurons. Sometimes you get studies of the brain where there's many, many, many neurons. Sometimes you can have studies of the brain where they measure the activity of the whole brain or the activity of whole brain regions. So neuroscience does study across those different scales, but it still isn't clear what the relationship is between those mental concepts, those mental notions, sophisticated concepts like justice, or sophisticated capacities like playing chess, and those kinds of neural studies and that kind of brain data. So neuroscience has made great strides over the past 200 years, depending on when you start its inception, sometime in the 19th century. Sometimes people argue it goes back to Descartes. But certainly in the past 100 years, it's made great strides in techniques, concepts, technologies, and we have made inroads. We have made progress in understanding certain capacities, but we still lack a global picture of how it all hangs together, especially when it comes to these relatively sophisticated concepts, like what you mentioned, like religion, for example, or what I would call relatively sophisticated folk psychological or common sense psychological concepts like belief and desire. You can even think of the practical syllogism from Aristotle, right? If I believe P, and I desire Q, and I believe if I believe that doing P will lead to Q, and I desire Q, then I should do P. And that kind of relatively simple inference, we still don't have a good handle on, in part because it's very difficult to line up our neuroscientific investigations and our neuroscientific insights with this kind of common sense psychological account of how our minds work. In fact, it's not even clear they will line up. Our psychological accounts were created, they've been around for millennia. In many ways, they seem to be deeply instilled in our minds, whether a result of development or enculturation. But it doesn't really look like what's going on in the brain is going to neatly map onto those concepts and ideas. So neuroscience is young. It's a relatively new science. The kinds of data we collect and the kinds of experiments we run share an unclear relation to these more sophisticated concepts and ideas, or these more common sense concepts and ideas. Consequently, I don't think we know yet exactly how we're going to understand the relationship between the kinds of things we're learning about the brain and those more sophisticated or common sense everyday concepts. I'm optimistic, but it is a multi-generational, I would argue, multi-millennial, really, research program.
Yeah, so I'm interested in maybe using common sense to work things out, because obviously it's difficult to design experiments for some of these ideas. And I'll just give an example. So 25 years ago, Steven Pinker made the point in his book, How the Mind Works, that if you think of liberty, like the word liberty, and then think of the Statue of Liberty, like you don't relay replay a movie reel for both of them. So obviously the mind uses abstract concepts, not images, but we still aren't really at the stage where we can actually design an experiment to prove that right or incorrect, or are we?
Right. So let me tease apart a couple parts of that question. So one aspect of that question is, does the mind operate using abstract concepts? Now, abstract concepts can mean different things. It could mean, for example, that you're talking about something that doesn't have an obvious or clear material basis in the world. So it might be something like, what's a good example of this? Some of the examples you gave before, like religion or justice or peace, fairness. These are kind of relatively abstract concepts perhaps that reflect human practices. There's a different sense of abstract concept whereby we are able to identify an instance of something regardless of how it's presented to us in our senses. So, for example, I can hear a car, I can see a car, I can feel a car. My representation of a car is abstract in the sense of in neuroscience and philosophy we talk about multimodality. So, modality would be like vision or hearing or touch, and we have concepts that are multimodal. In other words, they seem to be able to be picked out regardless of kind of the sensory access we have to an instance of the concept. So that's a different sense of abstract, possibly related. So I took your question to sort of be asking about both of those. But I would say
can
that...
we test those type of things?
Yeah, we can. So we can do things like, is there an area of the brain that recognizes or responds to an instance of a category, a concept like car, regardless of how it's presented. So I might have you listen to an audio of an engine starting, and I might also show you a movie and also a still picture. I might even describe a car to you. And these are all different ways of learning about the presence of a car, and we can look for areas in the brain that respond regardless of the source of that information. This is a big debate right now about where in the brain are there that kind of unifying one part of the is there one part of the brain that can respond to these different sources of perceptual information about the presence of a particular
like modularity, maybe that old idea of having a modular brain.
Yeah, right. And some people think, for example, that the anterior temporal cortex, which is a certain region of the brain near the front and the sides, may play that kind of role? Or rather, is it that the brain kind of has these separate representations that are essentially, or as we say in philosophy, constitutively linked to the source of the perceptual information? And instead, what the brain does is it calls on those different representations as needed to accomplish the task that it has before it. So that's an open question, a very active area of research right now, and there's people on both sides of that debate. So I would say that kind of question is sort of accessible. It's currently being studied. We have the techniques and tools to try to begin to understand and answer that question. The first question, this question about abstract categories in the sense of, for example, mathematical categories or moral categories, social categories of certain kinds. Those are more challenging to study. There are neuroscientists who are trying to study them. But I would say comparatively that we have less of a handle on what's going on in the brain with regard to those kinds of categories.
Interesting. Let's talk about the explore-exploit trade-off. So what is it? Okay. Why should everybody know about it? And how does it function or operate maybe a little bit differently in ADHD or people with ADHD traits or personality tendencies that maybe they don't have a full-on ADHD diagnosis, but they might have some of those traits like curiosity, maybe hyperactivity or exploratory behavior?
Yeah, good. So the explore-exploit trade-off refers to this kind of decision that animals and humans have to make, whereby you are deciding whether or not to continue doing what you're doing, and that would be exploiting, or instead you're going to explore for something new to do. You're gonna stop what you're doing, you're gonna explore for new opportunities. We face this kind of decision all the time. It could be something banal, like, for example, you're in the grocery store, you're trying to choose which cereal to eat. There's all of these different options before you. You might try the cereal you've been eating for the past few months. That would be like an exploit choice. You might try a new cereal. That would be like an explore choice. Now, these kinds of choices are kind of hierarchical. You're in the cereal aisle. You have a local decision about whether or not to explore the different cereals or to exploit the ones you're familiar with. You also have the decision to give up altogether on choosing cereals, maybe go to a different breakfast food, or maybe just continue on down the shopping list and head on over to the vegetables and buy things for dinner. That's another kind of explore-exploit trade-off. In this case, exploiting would be continuing to search for the cereal, versus exploration would be moving on and down your shopping list to try and buy some other different type of food. So, and these kinds of, I'm using this very simple example to illustrate some of the complexity of these kinds of trade-offs, and also this sort of hierarchical or layered nature of these kinds of trade-offs. So the explore-exploit trade-off, as you can imagine, also, of course, readily apparent, comes up all the time in animal behavior. Choosing between staying at the banana grove or looking for a new one is a kind of explore-exploit trade-off. Whether or not to continue with your social group or search for a new social group, again, that same sort of explore-exploit trade-off. Many explore versus exploit decisions are foraging decisions. There's a class, as I mentioned, foraging decisions earlier. These are iterated or a series of choices about whether to continue to exploit the option before you or to explore for a new one, to search for a new one. These kinds of decisions, I think, are very well illustrated by what's called the patch leaving problem. So an animal in the environment, let's say you're some sort of mammal, a bear, and you're at the blueberry patch and you're eating blueberries. And when you first get to the blueberry patch, a patch here just means a group of resources in the environment. The blueberries are ripe and they're plentiful and they're delicious and juicy. But the longer you're there, the better berries are eaten first. And the value of that patch begins to go down, or as neuroeconomists call it, the marginal value. Each additional berry you eat provides slightly less value to you. And at some point, the berries that are left there's very few of them. It's harder to find them, and the ones you do find tend to be of lower quality. So the overall value of staying in the patch, of exploiting the patch, has dropped. And at some point, you want to make the decision to leave the blueberry patch and search for a new one. And it is that kind of patch leaving decision that really well illustrates this explore-exploit trade-off during foraging. Okay, good. So that sort of gives you a framework for thinking about explore-exploit decisions. Let's talk a little bit about different kinds of human cognitive profiles now and how that might relate.
Just before you go on, would you separate these from personality traits, like the big five, and maybe again like cognitive strengths and weaknesses? Like, how do we say like in terms of like a cognitive profile? Are you talking about personality traits there, or something a little bit different?
I'm talking about something a little bit different because there's a relatively sophisticated theoretical apparatus between the personality trait research literature, behind the personality trait research literature, and to actively engage with that literature, you bring on board a lot of assumptions. Instead, what I'm really talking about in this case are different behavioral tendencies. So, for example, you might be, you mentioned creativity. That's a certain kind of behavioral tendency. There's a definition in the cognitive neuroscience literature where something is creative if it's useful and new, and idea is creative if it's useful and new, for example. So if you're more creative, you're able to come up with useful new ideas. There's something called the multiple uses test where I give you, a brick and I say, you have 1 minute to name as many uses for the brick as possible. You might start out with paperweight and end with a prop in a circus or something, right? So so what are we really doing there is, instead of constructing this rich and complex conceptual apparatus, we're sort of designing these behavioral tests and to investigate these kinds of behavioral traits, or I call them cognitive traits. So another one would be impulsivity. So if you're impulsive, there's various ways that we can measure that. Maybe, for example, you decide to switch tasks from responding to emails to making phone calls, or to surfing on Reddit or the internet more quickly or more often than in other individuals who are less impulsive. So you can imagine, you can basically endlessly come up with different kinds of traits of this nature and different ways of testing them. Now, one useful way to investigate these kinds of traits and their neuroscientific or neurological basis is to use individuals who experience psychological disorders or dysfunctions or afflictions of various kinds. With regards to traits like distractibility or impulsivity, one such psychiatric disorder or diagnosis is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, so ADHD. And ADHD has all different kinds of subtypes, of course, and is a sophisticated, complex psychiatric condition. And I want to emphasize that for many people, it is quite debilitating, and they do experience daily adversity in the kinds of tasks that other individuals complete with ease. So we shouldn't minimize some of the challenges that individuals with this diagnosis face. But it is, for the neuroscientists, an interesting and helpful tool, both to try to understand and help these individuals, but also to try and understand the basis for some of these traits, like impulsivity or distractibility. So did you want me to get into the study that I ran?
I do. I want you to talk about that study in detail in a second, because I even thought the way it was carried out was really interesting. But I'm just going to frame a question first. So, how do you bridge the idea that ADHD might have been an advantage in certain evolutionary settings with the mismatch hypothesis, where basically kids are bored in school, or maybe the modern environment is too complex for certain individuals with ADHD? So is it just that if you change the context completely or change the environment completely, suddenly people would actually start playing to their advantage? Like, is it completely an environment issue? would the
Yeah,
mismatch
good.
disappear?
So, yeah, right. Good. So this gets at some important questions. So one question you might have is ADHD sort of just the result of, for environmental reasons, sort of bad neural circuitry, bad luck, genetic drift, that kind of issue. And it really looks like no, the rate or prevalence of ADHD in the population is about 8% in children, about 5% in adults, if I recall correctly. And that's actually greater than you might anticipate seeing if that kind of explanation where it was just, oh, this is just natural variability in the human genome or natural variability in development. So then you enter this sort of more interesting set of questions where it's like, well, if can we give a genetic explanation? Can we give a different kind of explanation? One kind of explanation that relies on genetics would be, well, there is some traits, other genes, that give rise to traits that are quite advantageous. So in the population, generally speaking, these are helpful traits, but in some cases, having these genes in the population gives rise to individuals with these kinds of distractibility, impulsivity, and so on, inability to attend disorders. Another explanation would be that the genetic component, if there is one at the end of the day, for these kinds of disorders or conditions is directly tied to certain genes. So that in fact, the disorder or condition manifests in our contemporary context, but if you were to stick these individuals in a different context, it would be quite advantageous. There are ways we can test these kinds of hypotheses. We can try to manipulate the decision environment. So for example, earlier I described foraging as a kind of choice you're making where you're faced with an option, you kind of give a thumbs up or thumbs down. If it's a thumbs up, you get to accept that option and you get to get the value from it. If it's a thumbs down, you reject the option and you move on and search for a new one. Those kinds of decisions are very different from many of the decisions we make in our contemporary environment. Just to bring up the grocery store example again, you go to the cereal aisle, you're not offered one cereal. You're not like, do I want Cheerios or not? Or do I want Fruity Loops or not, right? Or do I want granola or not? You're offered kind of like everything all at once. And it's kind of this amazingly rich from a calorie or energy standpoint environment. It's kind of like, you wandered
It's too good to be true.
Yeah, exactly. You wandered into food heaven. Whereas like, if you think about what our ancestors had to do to get food, it was like dramatically different, right? It's not going to be anything like this. So consequently, you can imagine that our brains evolved in a totally different decision environment. And now we're in this great decision environment where we can like compare all these things all at once. But that's not necessarily what our brains were evolutionarily fine-tuned for. Of course, genetics does not dictate all of our behavior. Development plays a huge role. So does learning. So does just generally attuning oneself to one's environment. That's a set of skills as well. Nonetheless, for certain individuals, it might be the case that changing that characteristic of the decision environment can be very revelatory about what the neural circuits are that are giving rise to their behavior, and possibly what the neural circuits are that underlie some of these traits, like distractibility or impulsivity. So by manipulating the decision environment to look more like a kind of foraging decision environment than the kinds of rich, multi-option decision environments you face at the grocery store, might allow these individuals or some individuals to show that they have this capacity in excess in comparison to other individuals. A capacity, a skill that is honed for, designed for, in some sense, excels in a certain kind of decision environment.
That's really interesting. Do you want to just tell us a little bit about how you carried out the study? Because the research, I think it was published last year, was really fascinating. The design you used was definitely novel. I haven't seen it before. And as well, I just want to pick your brain on another question. So what modern environments, or maybe what modern occupations, might actually favor these type of traits, so that you see
Yeah.
ADHD. Like some people say hypercuriosity, some people might say exposure behavior, but then you also have inattention as well. So I'm just curious, what modern environment might actually place the strengths here for people with these type of traits?
Good. Yeah. So I'm going to describe the study first, and then maybe we can come back to after I
The study
describe
was
the
really
study.
cool. So yeah, get into the detail there a little bit.
Yeah.
It was interesting.
So in this conversation, I have described and noted a couple different threads. I've noted that foraging environments are different from other decision environments. I've noted that animals might be exquisitely tuned for foraging environments as a result of evolution and selective pressures. I've noted that there's different behavioral traits, and different traits might be adaptive in different contexts. And so if you put all that together, you can begin to design experiments that allow us to probe behaviorally, not even doing neural measurements, some of the differences between populations, humans, sets of humans, and whether or not they might excel in one environment in comparison to another, in comparison to other groups of humans. So we took foraging theory, and actually, you mentioned that this is an unusual design you hadn't seen before, but in foraging theory, it's a pretty standard design. So we took a relatively simple foraging task. Basically, individuals were faced with a choice between accepting the current offer, which on the computer screen was just a bush that they could click on, and then they would get some berries, or deciding to move on from that bush in search of a new one. So that's that same kind of decision I described earlier, where you're faced with a single option. You can click on that option, you can choose that option, you can get the value from the option, or you can reject the option and move on. And so we replicated that in the computer in the way I just described. They could click on the bush, they could get the berries, or they could click on a move on option and in search of the next bush. Now, we were really interested in that choice between accepting the current offer or rejecting it for the next bush. If participants accepted the offer, they were faced with the same choice again, same bush, but the amount of berries that they got reduced by some small amount. So as they choose that same bush over and over and over, the amount of berries they get goes down, just like the bear choosing the ripest, juiciest berries at first, and then over time being left with less appealing options. If they chose, so at some point participants usually choose to leave, because when you choose to leave, there's a timeout, so they have to sit and wait for a couple seconds, and they're offered a new bush. Now, there's some notable aspects of this. First, the value of the bush is reset to its original value. So all of a sudden, it's like the bear is in a new berry patch, and there's all ripe berries again. Secondly, we got rid of the search part. So we were really interested in this: do I want to accept where I am, this exploit decision, or do I want to give up where I am for the next opportunity? And that's like the explore decision. But we got rid of search. So we said, okay, if you explore, you're just going to have to wait, basically having the participants sit and wait a couple seconds as actually a new bush came down the screen and stopped. And then they get to choose that one. And the reason we do that, it's a simplification, but it allows us to hone in on that specific decision about when to give up, a giving up decision. And in ecology, it's actually called a giving up time, a GUT. Okay, good. So why should we use that design? Well, the hypothesis is that sometimes it's really good to move on from a bush to search for a new one. And a very widespread finding in ecology and in foraging, the study of foraging, is that animals across the evolutionary spectrum tend to stay too long at these kinds of resources that are depleting. They over-harvest is the phrase. They overstay their welcome. They end up, to use the bear example again, it's the bear hanging out in the berry patch where it's at, past when it should search for a new one. It keeps on finding these smaller and smaller, wrinkled, low-value berries instead of searching for the new berry patch and getting nice ripe ones again. So this is true for almost every animal species tested. It's particularly true for humans and other primates. Humans and other primates stay too long at patches of resources that are depleting well past the time when they should move on. So we This is a study that we conducted over the internet. This is a study that was designed at the height of the pandemic when we were all kind of stuck inside, and we wondered, how could we design a study that we can have participants run from their computers at home, where we can ask some interesting questions about this kind of foraging behavior. And we also had participants fill out a self-report survey, actually many self-report surveys, one of which was an ADHD self-report survey, an ASRS. Now, this self-report survey for ADHD, of course, we're not testing for ADHD itself. That's a clinical diagnosis. You have to go into a doctor and be clinically diagnosed. But there are these surveys that are well validated. That just means that if you score highly on the survey and then we subsequently test you for ADHD, you're likelier than not to have ADHD. So they're validated in that sense. And these surveys are short.
I guess just to come in there for 1 second, like, I guess it is good to be aware as well. Like, some people do have maybe traits or personality tendencies that might resemble subclinical ADHD. Like, it's not always necessarily categorical disorder. So, like, you can still use these traits to implement the experiment without actually having to have a diagnosis.
That's exactly right. And I'm going to circle back. Let me flag that. I'll circle back to it in a moment. Because what we did is we took those scores and we correlated them. That means we looked to see how well they predicted performance on the task. Or actually, if I remember the order of analysis, we did the other way around. We looked at performance on the task, and we saw how well it predicted those scores. And what we found was that individuals who scored highly, in other words, who self-reported these ADHD-like traits, like being impulsive and distractible, performed better than individuals who did not self-report those kinds of traits. Now, as I just mentioned, and as you just pointed out, we didn't test for ADHD. We were really giving a self-report survey for these ADHD-associated traits, like being distractible and impulsive. Let me just say a couple things. First of all, we actually predicted the opposite. We didn't predict that they would do better. We thought that they would leave patches sooner and do worse. But because, as I just described, humans tend to stay too long in these patches, they harvest berries too long, leaving sooner, which is what we did find in ADHD, individuals who self-reported greater ADHD-like traits, they did leave sooner. But because they left sooner, they overstayed their welcome less. In other words, they did better. They left the patches closer to when they should have than the other individuals who did not report being impulsive or distractible. So a very surprising finding. The very first, we could quantify that benefit. This was the first sort of quantifiable benefit for these kinds of traits. And even though we use the ADHD self-report survey, I actually think, and this gets directly at the point you just made, the findings are even more interesting because they have much broader applicability. Because we weren't testing for ADHD specifically, we didn't have a clinical test of these individuals, a clinical diagnosis. What we were really examining is the impact on the traits that are ADHD-like, being distractible, being impulsive. And we've found that there are benefits for those traits. Now, being distractible, being impulsive, these are traits that everyone has to some degree in different contexts and at different times. Now, in the popular media, these are oftentimes seen as negative traits. But if they were really universally negative, to use sort of a hand-wavy back-of-the-envelope evolutionary argument, you wouldn't expect us to really be all that distractible or impulsive. But I think it's common experience of almost everyone at times that we are sometimes very distractible and impulsive. So it kind of makes you wonder, at least raises the question of, why are we distractible and impulsive to the degree that we are? And it turns out that in certain contexts, being distractible and impulsive is a benefit. In particular, it looks like in these kinds of foraging, explore, exploit choices, having these traits can be beneficial. Why? They're beneficial because you leave a poor resource sooner in search of a new one.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So what do you think in terms of like modern jobs now, or modern occupations? I've heard people say different things here. Like, I've heard people mention war, but let's try and let's go with something a bit more that you might see commonly in the Western world. So something like, I think polygenic studies actually suggest that ADHD people or people with ADHD traits might actually veer towards entrepreneurship and opening a business. So I presume that's a risk-taking factor. So would you say, obviously, in certain settings, like that level of risk-taking, even a modern environment, can be advantageous?
Right. So let me first just provide a qualification. So I sometimes use the phrase ADHD-like traits. ADHD, as I mentioned earlier, it's a serious
Yeah,
syndrome. It's a debilitating
yeah,
disorder for many individuals. We shouldn't minimize how
yeah,
disruptive it is. I think it's very
yeah,
important to keep in mind. And I'll emphasize, as I always do when I discuss my research on this, we were really only assessing ADHD-like
yeah,
traits for using
yeah,
these self-report. Okay, good. That's
yeah,
important to keep in mind.
yeah.
Um,
Yeah, because
so
again, just on that point, like some studies do take participants with an ADHD diagnosis and include them in the study, but other studies kind of does a survey or a self-assessment where they just try and distinguish certain traits that you would see. So there is a distinction there, yeah, and it is important to make that. So fair point.
yeah, that's right. And the study that I described a moment ago, this foraging study that I mentioned, where we found this advantage for individuals who self-reported highly these traits. I'm now in the early stages of rerunning that in person with
Wow.
confirmed ADHD diagnosed
Okay.
individuals.
Well, that's fascinating.
Um,
Okay.
because we want to confirm the findings and actually see if there are some
Wow.
interesting further sets
Yeah, it would be
follow-ups.
amazing to get a replication there. That would be fascinating.
Yeah, exactly. Especially in the patient population. Okay, good. But the findings, as I mentioned, also are much more general, and they really do have to do with the advantages of these types of traits. And that's what your
Yeah.
question is really about. It really is about, is being
Yeah.
distractible, is being impulsive, does it have advantages in certain contexts? You mentioned this business context. I'm unfamiliar with those kinds of studies. I'm hesitant to endorse. I mean, I would need to read this study.
Yeah.
But you could imagine something like that is true in the following sense. Suppose that you have a startup. So let's take the entrepreneur case. You have some sort of seed money. Suppose you've gone through a friends and family round, an angel investors round. So you have an initial sort of bank of seed money to get your project and your idea, your new company up and off the ground. There are going to be, especially early days, there's going to be some rough and tumble. There's going to be challenges, unforeseen or foreseen. There's going to be setbacks. There may also be initial successes. You might think in other words, your idea has hit on a rich resource, a rich patch. But instead of being a berry patch, it's an idea in the consumer environment. It's an idea in the business environment. And what one needs to do is to really try as best one can something like a cost-benefit analysis, where you're thinking, okay, if I continue to invest in this, I have the cost of time. I'm not able to use that time doing other things. I'm also using up the money I have in the bank to do certain things. And at some point, I need to make a decision about whether to carry on or to search for a new thing. I would say that in the early days of those kinds of projects, having a kind of foraging perspective is helpful. So individuals who are impulsive or distractible might be able to get an advantage by leaving certain projects early that ultimately would not have panned out. And that could mean switching to a new product line. It could also mean, opening a new company, giving up on the current value of the company you've started to start a new one, something along those lines. I'll note, though, that foraging is not, and this relates to a question very early on in the discussion, is not all of decision making. There are many kinds of decisions which are not foraging and where you should not forage. So, for
Okay.
example, example I like to use is a very sophisticated one, has to do with math. Early on, when you're trying to prove something in math, you might be engaged in a foraging type of search, and I've argued that you are. But if you're nearing the end of your proof, you shouldn't move on because the progress is hard. sometimes you have to stick to it. So this is where having another set of traits is very helpful. And the same thing is true in the business world. There might be unforeseen complexities and challenges, especially very late on in projects, where it really does pay to persevere. And so I can imagine there's contexts where having these kinds of traits in the business world are quite advantageous, they're beneficial. And I can also imagine contexts where having the trait of perseverance or stick-to-itiveness is sometimes something you hear, or resilience also is related. This grit is also related to this ability to withstand various slings and arrows of the experiences that you are undergoing, can also be very beneficial. So I don't, these kinds of blanket generalizations, I think, are very challenging to make. We have to take into account the business environment or the environment in which the decision is being made.
Yeah, fascinating. So we're nearly on the hour. I have two more questions, so I'm going to put them into one, and you can give me an answer for both as long as you want. Okay, so my first question is, a big trend maybe online, so with people who maybe self-identify as having ADHD or self-identify as having ADHD-like traits, is hyperfocus. Now, there is a little bit of research on this having emerged over the last few years, especially in adults. So the idea that a person with ADHD maybe is very best in something they're really curious about or they really like, and maybe they can't regulate their attention off of that. And I guess in an evolutionary context or in an exploratory context, is that like the equivalent of a forager striking gold, or maybe going in for the kill when they find a resource-heavy patch? Or what are your thoughts on hyperfocus? Like, I'm trying to figure out how that kind of layers onto this whole thing. My other question is, like, is there a point where you really, you just don't stop, you go for gold because you know you've hit on something? And my second question is, so again, for years, maybe even decades, and a lot of the narrative around, like mechanistically around ADHD was based around dopamine. Now, but I think maybe norepinephrine, and even not just in ADHD, in cognition in general, and motivation, and all the other good stuff, dopamine was like considered one of the main neurochemicals, and it's probably the most well known. But you think, I have a feeling you would say norepinephrine is maybe just as important. So you can answer both, like, in whatever order you want.
Good. Okay, great. So the second question had to do with dopamine versus norepinephrine.
Yeah, and the first one, the hyperfocus idea.
Hyperfocus, yeah, good. So ADHD, of course, it comes in sort of all these different subphenotypes. There's all these different subtypes. And I probably should emphasize this earlier. My background is in foraging theory.
Yeah.
It's an interesting question how gathering resources interacts with the hyperfocus subtype.
And I guess we should say as well, hyperfocus isn't exclusive to ADHD. Like, a lot of people do seem to experience.
That's right. And you can imagine,
so we can broaden this as a cognitive trait, maybe, or a cognitive habit.
That's right. And hyperfocus, of course, can be beneficial in some of those cases that I mentioned a moment ago, where you need the stick-to-itiveness and the single-pointed concentration on a particular topic or a particular problem in order to resolve that problem and to make progress. And there's going to be an interesting metacognitive problem when you should engage that hyperfocus versus when you should not, and just rely on or resort to the more typical decision circuitry to make a decision about whether or not to hone down, barrel down, and hone in on the problem you're facing, versus saying, oh, you know what, the expected value of continuing to work on this has dropped below some threshold, and I should go and do something else. So I would say that the study that we published doesn't pay to be hyper-focused. So I don't think it was a good probe for that aspect of
I'm actually, I suppose I'm giving you a thought experiment. Maybe I'm putting you in the spot. Sorry. So how do you think it could play out? I'm just curious, because I've been thinking about this myself since I read your paper.
Here's how I think it could play out. So one way it could play out is by being especially attuned to cues in the environment, and that could be the external world, but could also be an abstract environment like a problem space in business, or logical space or mathematical space if you're working in math or logic. Clues that
so you're prioritizing it.
Clues that are giving you information that there's a lot of value in the approach you're taking, but they're hard to discern clues. So you have to have very fine-grained attention to notice them. And they encourage sticking to it. So the hyperfocus, the ability to pick out these fine-grained details, allow you to get a better estimate of the expected value, what you think the payoff will be by sticking to a particular problem. So it's in that kind of context that I would predict that you, and by the way, even just if you think about this in terms of environmental foraging, wandering around the environment, a lot of food isn't obvious. So being able to pay attention to very fine-grained details of the environment and infer from the presence of those cues to great payoff can be very rewarding. And so it's not surprising you see these traits, and it's not surprising that they can be quite beneficial. Okay, good. So that's the kind of context in which I would expect this kind of hyperfocus to be useful. Let me shift to the
dopamine,
last
norepinephrine.
question had to do with dopamine versus norepinephrine. So
everybody loves dopamine, but I think norepinephrine might be a bit underrated, and maybe you might agree here.
Yeah. Dopamine, epinephrine, serotonin, norepinephrine, they're all monoamines, monoaminergic neurotransmitters in the brain. They're typically released by specialized nuclei in the brainstem. They're archaic. They exist, or versions of these neurotransmitters exist in almost every species, oftentimes playing somewhat similar roles. So that means that they are these archaic kinds of signaling molecules in the brain. They've been around for eons and eons across many different species and generations. I think we're still actually in early days. There's been a lot of focus on dopamine because there have been some very beautiful, sophisticated models of what dopamine is doing. Norepinephrine has had some modeling, but less of a focus. Unquestionably, ADHD involves both dopaminergic and noradrenergic or norepinephrine dysregulation or disorders. I think atomoxetine, if I recall correctly, is a noradrenergic inhibitor that's used to treat ADHD. It's oftentimes, sometimes it's even the first line, but I think it's usually a second line after dopaminergic intervention. So these are, ADHD, like all psychiatric conditions, is a complex condition. It's going to involve many different subsystems in the brain, many different signaling systems, noradrenergic, dopaminergic, many different brain regions. It's a complex manifestation of many different changes, signaling and processing changes that have occurred in the brain. So I think in order to allow these individuals to lead healthy and productive lives, we want to pursue all of our options, and we want to try and leave the door open and explore the effects of all these different kinds of molecules. I will say in my own research, and this is unpublished data, I want to note that because I was unable to complete the study because actually I finished my PhD. But in monkeys, I did some foraging studies, and I was able to do some pharmacological manipulations. And in particular, I was basically able to boost their norepinephrine to see if it changed these foraging decisions about whether, almost identical to the study I described earlier, the monkeys were choosing to stay at a berry bush essentially and to get rewards. And at some point, as the rewards decreased, they decided to move on. And these noradrenergic manipulations induced earlier decisions to depart patches. And so that's, as I mentioned, unpublished, so not peer reviewed, but it's an interesting, very preliminary indicator that these kinds of manipulations really are impacting foraging circuitry specifically. And that's consistent with the ADHD-like traits being different in foraging tasks. That's the behavioral study I mentioned. And norepinephrine being an important molecule and a pharmacological target, a therapeutic target for individuals with ADHD. So
and I guess if we expand this out, like not just discussing people with ADHD-like traits or maybe diagnosed ADHD. For the general population, I do think there's more involved in cognition or concentration or motivation or pursuit than just dopamine. Like obviously norepinephrine is involved as well. And I do think that even like a stimulant like caffeine or more powerful stimulants that are used to treat certain conditions, I would imagine they do interact with both neurochemicals. Like norepinephrine probably just doesn't get as much airways, I don't think. Maybe it's not as well understood.
I actually, I would push back entirely against the idea that single molecules do anything.
Yeah, I agree. It's
that
a network.
Not the way that we're understanding how cognition works in the brain. They're all parts of a complex mechanism, and they play a role in that complex mechanism, but you cannot map from a complex cognitive trait to the role of a single molecule. It's a massive conceptual error.
Yeah, and it's strange because like these neurotransmitters have found their way very much into how our public understanding of the brain and how cognition works. Like people do refer to these neurotransmitters, especially dopamine and maybe serotonin a bit less, but we don't talk about brain networks, which are obviously more important because, as you said, like a lot of this happens at a global level in the brain. So things like the default mode network and the salience network, like they probably should be discussed more because they are extremely important and they do reflect a lot of how we carry out our daily tasks.
That's exactly right. And also very complicated pieces of neural machinery. And it's very important to keep that in mind that these are complex phenomena. They have a complex physical basis in the brain. It's going to require a lot of work to uncover those bases.
Yeah. David, thank you so much. We're way over time, so we better finish. But I really appreciate it. That was a really interesting conversation. I actually really enjoyed it. I'd like to maybe get you back again sometime if you're willing. Maybe after the second study is published, if you're interested.
Yeah, absolutely, no problem. Thank you so much for having me on.
There's a lot in your work that we could touch on that I haven't gone to today. If you'd like to join again sometime, that'd be great. But thanks so much.
Absolutely.